Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to tonight's joint program between Temple Emmanuel and Writer's Block on gun violence prevention and national security. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in its 23rd year. Thank you. And I'm a member of Temple Emmanuel. Now, you guys could be at home watching MSNBC with Rachel Maddow, but tonight, Sarah Bassin, our rabbi, is going to stand in for Rachel Maddow. I want to thank the president of our congregation, Barry Brucker, as well as Sue Brucker, the head of our Gun Violence Prevention Committee. Thanks also to the Religious Action Center and the Jewish Center for Justice. On behalf of both Writer's Block and Temple Emmanuel, we're so proud to host Congressman Adam Schiff. Right now, Writer's Block hosts all sorts of major voices in politics, the arts, and culture. Adam Schiff is a really modest, self-effacing guy. But now he's a rock star. And Writer's Block has hosted plenty of both literal and figurative rock stars in a variety of fields. But no one before Congressman Schiff has crashed the Writer's Block server. I mean, this guy, he broke my website. He broke the internet. So now for tonight, this special series on gun violence prevention and security launched after the massacre in Pittsburgh, and we feel the urgency after Friday's attack in New Zealand to talk about our security. This is the second in a series on the topic, wherein we invite the most influential voices in government and society to weigh in on the subject. Gun violence and national security are nonpartisan issues. Bullets don't discriminate. They're pretty open-minded about killing anything they touch. But make no mistake, Congressman Schiff is no friend of the NRA. He consistently earns an F rating year after year after year. Congressman Schiff has clearly become the go-to expert for our favorite fake news channels for so many issues. That's because in 2016, as ranking member of the United States House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, he made it his business to get to the bottom of a variety of investigations and to become a thorn in the side of obfuscation and evasion. In 2018, when the Democrats retook the House, God, you guys are so easy. Schiff exchanged seats with Devin Nunes and became chair of that committee. So, Congressman Schiff's purview as chair of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence is massive in scope. He oversees all intelligence agencies, including the FBI, as well as the Department of Justice, the Department of State, Homeland Security, and more. That's all in a day's work for this guy, and all very closely tied to gun violence prevention and national security, of course. Rabbi Sarah Bassin is the resident activist leader here at Temple Emmanuel. She's also an activist leader who has become a role model for other young clergy across the country. She stands by her convictions and is fearless as she goes the distance. When there's a social issue to tackle, she's on it before we can say march. Rabbi Bassin will chat with Congressman Schiff about gun violence and other threats to personal as well as national security. You have index cards on your seat, which you can use to jot down your questions. Volunteers will collect the cards, will be going down through the aisles, and will hand them to Congressman Schiff. He'll take as many as he can. Before I introduce Rabbi Bassin and Congressman Schiff, I want to add that these programs are really costly. Tonight is free. Ted Lieu is free. If any of you are interested in supporting these specific events, please see Rabbi Bassin or myself after the program. Thank you so much. It is my great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Sarah Bassin and Congressman Adam Schiff.
Thank you very much.
So, Congressman, I want to welcome you on behalf of the board, all of the Temple Emmanuel members and the clergy. We've got Cantor Lizzie Weiss and Rabbi Adam Lutz and Jonathan Aaron as well. I also want to thank Andrea Grossman and Writer's Block for making tonight possible. And an additional thank you to the Jewish Center for Justice and to Jerry and Lorraine Factor for their support of this event. So when all of you came in, you may have noticed a small group of anti-vaccination protesters. I want to acknowledge that they are here to exercise their First Amendment rights, and we value their right to do so. But I also want to acknowledge that we are here to speak about gun violence prevention and about national security. So I'm going to take rabbinic prerogative to frame what's happening outside before we move on into our conversation. You may know that Jewish tradition deeply values holding a minority opinion and recording that minority opinion. However, it is also true that sometimes we record that minority opinion simply to note that it is wrong. Not just now, but for future generations to know that as well. So the clergy here at Temple Emmanuel, we believe that there is a moral imperative and a communal responsibility to ensure our communal health through vaccination, especially for those in our midst. Especially for those in our midst with compromised immune systems who rely on us to do our part. So please know that if there are any disruptive attendees who attend tonight, we ask that everybody refrain from responding and remain seated. Those folks will be escorted out by our security. Additionally, I ask that from this point on, I very much appreciated all of the applause that I was getting at the beginning, but please refrain from applause throughout the rest of the conversation. It'll enable us to get through a lot more conversation and take advantage of the fact that we have such an amazing national leader here with us. Does that all sound good to everybody here? Excellent. Okay, last applause before the end. So with that, let's begin the conversation. In the aftermath of the attack on those mosques in New Zealand, the Prime Minister immediately took steps to change that nation's gun laws. We are facing a very different conversation in America with mass shooting after mass shooting. And yet, at the same time, we've just had H.R. 8 pass the House, the bill on universal background checks. It's now in the Senate. And Connecticut State Supreme Court just ruled that the families of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting victims are able to sue the gunmaker. You tweeted your intent to propose a bill to remove immunity from gun manufacturers altogether. So my question for you is this conversation around gun violence actually shifting? What's your strategy for building real inroads on creating a transformative conversation and transformative laws that will help keep us safe?
Well, first of all, Rabbi, I just want to thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank my dear friend and law school classmate Carl Thurmond for not only extending the invitation on your behalf, but being relentless in pursuit of my attendance.
He's good at that.
And as much as the folks outside feel passionately about anti-vaccines, I would much rather face them than have to turn down Carl Thurmond. So it's a pleasure. And by the way, I'm trying to just branch out my opposition from the pro-Trump people who pick at me quite often. It's a treat to be with you, and Rabbi, thank you for your work, and thank you for the activism of so many in the congregation on the important issue of gun violence. We were reminded again, horrified again, with another mass shooting, but we have them, of course, on our own soil on a regular basis, sometimes every month, sometimes every week, sometimes it seems every day, and of course the scourge of gun violence that doesn't involve a mass shooting goes on practically every hour. And I refuse to accept that this is somehow inescapable for us, that there is nothing we can do. And I think things are changing, and I'll share with you, both the good news and the bad news of, this present moment. The bad news is that the distinction to which there was one, or we've tried to make one, between domestic and international terror is really gone. The problem that we are seeing from domestic terrorists now in many ways exceeds the challenge that we face from internationally inspired terror. But at the same time, the terror in New Zealand was inspired internationally. So what exactly is that? Is that domestic violence for the people of that country, or was that international terrorism because his inspiration came from other places? We are seeing, I think, considerable movement in the public, and it's reflected in what we saw, not just in the vote we had in the House on these two important bills, but the fact that there were so many members of Congress there to vote in support in the House. Members of Congress who ran for Congress on a platform of common sense gun safety legislation and did so not in the usual places. They ran in places that were not deep blue, but purple and red. And it's telling that these candidates didn't run away from the issue, they ran towards this issue. That tells you that something is changing. And when you think, though, about still what a small step we have taken in passing in one chamber a universal background check, it's a clear indication of just how much farther we have to go. Now, I find it astounding still that we have a system in this country where you can go into a store to buy a firearm and be refused because they do a background check and you're a felon, or you have a history of domestic violence against your former spouse. And you can leave that store and you can buy the same weapon off the back of someone's truck, and it's perfectly legal. Or you can wait until you get home and you can order the same weapon online, and it's perfectly legal. That makes no sense to anyone, except, I suppose, the NRA. But to any logical thinking person, that is a recipe for disaster, and we've seen those disasters time and time again. But I really do think that we are reaching finally a tipping point in this country. And I think that tipping point has been accelerated by the courage and by the tenacity and by the force of these Parkland survivors, these young people who have determined that they are not going to allow this to continue. We are going to get to that tipping point, but like many tipping points, we can't tell yet how near or how far it is. I remember, during the years in which we fought for marriage equality, that it seemed that it probably might not happen in our lifetime. And then it did, and it came with such a rush that it was breathtaking. And I think the same will happen on the issue of gun violence, that we may not know when we are on the immediate precipice of major change, major societal change, but that change is coming for no other reason that young people are going to insist upon it. And certainly when they reach the critical mass, the critical voting mass, then it will happen. But I hope and pray, and we need to work to make sure it happens well before then. The fact that, and this was so striking to me, that, and you can be forgiven for not even remembering this shooting because there are so many who can keep track anymore, but there was a shooting in Santa Fe, not Santa Fe, New Mexico, but Santa Fe, Texas. And they interviewed this young girl at this middle school or high school. And they asked her, "Did you ever imagine something like this could happen at your school?" And her answer was, "Well, yes, why wouldn't it?" And the fact that kids now have to think about that is just a fact of life when they go to school. I refuse to accept that this is the best we can do. And we have to make sure that people in Congress understand that support from the NRA is a liability, that the refusal to stand up to the NRA puts you in more peril, not less, of losing your job. And until we can convince a majority of members of both houses that's the case, we're going to see these needless tragedies continue. But I think we're getting there. And once we show the NRA can be beaten, then I think the change will come very quickly. I will say this about the bill that I've introduced now for several years and will be reintroducing. When this bill passes, we will know that the war is won, because it will be the last bill to pass. This is a bill that will repeal a unique immunity from liability that only one industry in the country enjoys, and that's the gun industry. About 15 or 20 years ago, the NRA made its top legislative priority the passage of a Orwellian-sounding bill called Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PLACA, which basically not only immunized the gun industry from negligence, but also immunized the gun lobby itself. And as the NRA really represents not its members, but the money, the makers of the guns, there is nothing it fears more than losing that immunity from liability. It's true we had a victory in Connecticut with the Sandy Hook plaintiffs, whose lawsuit was allowed to continue, but in part, and of course this will be challenged, in part it was allowed to continue because they framed the challenge in a very narrow way, that the gun makers mismarketed their weapons, that they marketed them for the purpose of killing other humans. That's a very narrow theory of liability. And I'm glad it was successful. But it should be enough that anyone is negligent to be held responsible. Why is it that if you go to a bar and you're served and you're underage and they're negligent about checking your ID and you go out and you commit vehicular manslaughter, you can be held responsible? But if you knowingly look the other way and you sell multiple firearms to the same person who is so clearly a straw purchaser for others who are legally ineligible to buy a firearm, that you are protected. That makes no sense. And when we are able to do away with that, when we are able to insist that this industry, like any other, must maintain a certain standard of good faith and care, then we'll know the battle is won. But we have a lot more work to do, and your activism is what's going to carry the day. So I'm deeply grateful for all you're doing.
So our synagogue came to gun violence prevention in large part because of the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh that was carried out by a white nationalist. I think that right-wing extremism takes up a tremendous amount of space in terms of the actual cases of violence carried out through guns. The Anti-Defamation League has indicated that over the past decade, more than 70% of murders carried out in the name of extremism of some sort have been carried out by right-wing extremists. And we see that it's a disproportionate focus that we're putting actually on Islamist extremism instead. That's also true of the national rhetoric and the conversation, with our president just remarking that he believes that white nationalism is a very, very small problem. I think the actual quote was, I think it's a small group of people who have very, very serious problems. Is our intelligence focus and our actual policy more on track with where the actual threat is from this right-wing extremist entity? Or is our security apparatus still more focused on our prior threat that we understood to be greater of Islamist extremism? And do you see that shift catching up or happening?
I think it is true that the focus still remains disproportionately on the threat posed by the ISIS and Al-Qaeda narratives and their ability to inspire domestic terrorism, their ability to inspire people not who come to our shores for the purpose of committing terrorist acts, but who were born here and who were raised here, but who are influenced by this online propaganda. That has been the predominant focus of our anti-terror efforts, in addition to keeping people who would commit acts of terror out of the country. But while we've had our focus on that, we have seen this explosion in the volume of this far-right violent extremism. And we are starting to adjust. There, I think, is a twofold problem of a lack of investigative attention and focus on this, as well as laws that were really geared to a different kind of a terrorist threat. So that's changing. We're looking now at whether we need to update the laws so that prosecutors don't have to bend themselves into different permutations to find the right offense, where none may be a perfect fit for someone who is a domestic terrorist motivated by far-right violent extremist ideology and is not pledged fealty to some former foreign terrorist organization. So we are catching up with the problem, but I think we still have more work to do. And I think this is, of course, the most extreme form of what we're seeing, which is our far broader problem, and that is the rise of hatred and the ability to which it is becoming okay to express the most vile thoughts publicly and through social media. The way that social media now, the function of many of the algorithms in social media tend to lead people down a rabbit hole of greater and greater extremism, where if you search up one video on YouTube that leads you to extreme content and you watch it, then the other videos that are recommended to you lead you to even more extremist content, which leads you to even more extremist content. And these algorithms were not written to make extremists out of us all, and they have the same effect on left as on right. They were designed to keep our eyeballs on the platform. They were designed to show us what we wanted to see so that we will spend more time and buy more goods. But we are learning a lot about the unintended consequences of how social media operates. I think that a lot of what's going on at home and around the world with the rise of a xenophobic brand of populism is the result of two revolutions that are happening at the same time. We have a revolution in the world economy, which is, I think, on a par with the Industrial Revolution as a result of globalization and automation and AI. That is every bit as disruptive as the Industrial Revolution, with millions and millions of people losing their jobs through no fault of their own. And at the same time, a revolution in information that is every bit as significant as the invention of the printing press. I really think it no exaggeration to say so. We now get information instantly from a variety of sources in a world in which lies travel far faster than truth. We get information that is curated for us. I'm old enough to remember rushing back to my dormitory in college to see Walter Cronkite's last broadcast. That was a time when there was a large body of accepted fact, and we might differ on what to do with those facts, but at least we agreed that certain things were fact. And then we moved to a model in the 90s where we would tune into the news we wanted to hear, and you would pick your channel. But we're now in a place where the news is presented and curated for us on our phone. And most Americans get their news now not from TV, not from the newspaper, but from their phone. And our phone knows what we read, what we like, what we dislike, knows our religion, our ethnic origin, who our friends are. And it's a revelation to many people over the age of 20 that when I look at my social media newsfeed and you look at yours, Rabbi, it's not the same. You're getting different news than I am. And we're certainly getting different news than other parts of the country is getting. And that may be among the most cross-cutting problems of all. But it, at the moment, tends towards balkanization, tends towards incivility, and it can tend towards violence.
Can you speak a little bit to the ways in which you're both working with the social media platforms and the search engine companies and holding them accountable? I think there's a tension between those two, stick and carrot. What's your approach in trying to get a handle on this issue?
This issue came to me and came to the Intelligence Committee in a very offhand way. It came to us through the medium of Russian intervention in our election. The Intelligence Committee is not the natural venue to be holding hearings on the social media and technology sectors. But as we called in these executives from Facebook and Twitter and Google to explore what the Russians were doing on their platform and how easy it was and how they spread misinformation and how they exploited divisions in our society and how they helped turn one American against another along these well-trod fault lines of race and gender and sexual orientation and immigration status, we started to discover a lot of other things about the impact of social media and these algorithms and what it was doing to our civil discourse. And the more that I dug into this problem, the more I realized that this is a much bigger problem than foreign interference on our social media platforms and the impact on elections. And that problem alone is enough to keep you up at night. If you're not already concerned about it, let me tell you something that will ruin your day. In 2016, I was most concerned that while the Russians were hacking and dumping stolen documents, that they would start dumping forgeries among the real. For the most part, as far as we could tell, what they were dumping were authentic, stolen DNC Clinton emails. But of course, there was nothing to prevent them from dumping forgeries. And you could easily take an email that was 2 paragraphs long and add a third paragraph in which, in a discussion between 2 Clinton campaign workers, there was a discussion of illegality. Now, you can imagine if 3 weeks before the election, something like that were to surface. Something which had superficial credibility because these are 2 real people talking to each other, and at least 2/3 of it could be completely corroborated because, in fact, 2/3 of it was accurate. What you can imagine what a disruptive impact, how impossible in our polarized world it would be to disprove a forgery like that. Well, the capacity for that kind of mischief now by foreign parties is exponentially greater because technology has changed. There's a technology now called deep fakes, which allows you to make absolutely convincing but fake video or audio. They could produce a video of me or you or anyone else tomorrow, which would be almost indistinguishable. And so if you think back to the video of Mitt Romney talking about the 47%, okay, that had an election-altering impact. Now, I'm not saying it was the difference between winning and losing, but it certainly was consequential. That was nothing. It was nothing compared to the words you could put in Mitt Romney's mouth now. That would be completely invented. And good luck trying to prove that that video is a forgery in the midst of heated campaign. And I think, experts in psychology will tell you that if you see something that casts a negative impression on someone, even if you're later convinced that what you saw was a fake, you will never rid yourself of the negative impression, which will linger. So just the potential for foreign mischief is great enough. But what this revolution in communication is doing to divide us, unintentionally but nonetheless, is of far greater consequence. And it's not like we can legislate an algorithm for Facebook or tell Fox News what they can say. There is no easy fix for this. And it will take time, I think, for us as a society and a civilization to fully understand how this new communication world works and what are the antidotes and how to create some sense of civility in this new medium. And I wish I could tell you I have the answer, but all I can tell you is we are even late to be asking the right questions. Mm-hmm. But we are starting to ask the right questions. And we are starting to call on those that have a responsibility, in addition to the government, in the private sector, to be good citizens and to analyze this problem themselves when they've had a very strong economic incentive to deny it even exists. So the first step, I think, is to understand the problem. And then we can start to look at solutions. Some of them are already self-evident, but they're very small bore. We know, for example, that we need to require disclosures of political advertising in social media. There's no reason they should be exempt anymore. If I do an ad on TV, it has my picture on it and it says that I approve this ad. Why should it be different? Why should I be able to advertise anonymously on social media? I should be required to put my name on my expenditure. And so that's the low-hanging fruit. There's a lot more we're going to have to do, but there's also a capacity for government to do great harm, and we want to make sure that we don't do harm, and that means we need to understand the problem better.
So now that you've sufficiently scared us, I want to ask you about other things that we should be afraid of as well. I've got a list of about 5 or 6 things, and you could probably spend an hour on any one of them, but if we could do these in a little bit more of a kind of a rapid fire way, where I think it would be helpful just to get some insight into how you are thinking about these issues and maybe where they should be on our priority list. So bullet point A on my list is authoritarianism. It's on the rise throughout the world, and I saw a surprising poll from the Pew Research Center that said here in the United States, 22% of Americans are very much into the idea of a strong leader who's not accountable to any sort of representative body or a judicial system. Does the lack of belief in the checks and balances of democracy threaten our democracy's actual functioning?
Well, I'm very glad you asked that question. Because for the last 2 years, I have tried to call the public's attention to what was going on around the world. As people were so fixated on what Rudy Giuliani said in the morning, and how he contradicted himself in the afternoon, and how he got a completely different story from him in the evening, it was easy to lose sight of the bigger picture, which is, yes, the Russians attacked our democracy in 2016, and it was very effective. And we need to protect ourselves from that happening again. But what the Russians did here may have been unique for us. It was certainly unique in size and scope, but it wasn't at all unique in terms of what the Russians have been doing in other parts of the world, where they've been likewise interfering and attacking fellow democracies. But the problem, in fact, is much bigger than Russia. The problem is that there is a rise of authoritarianism going on all over the world. And in a normal world, the United States and our president would be fighting back, would be championing democracy, would be pushing for press freedom, would be making common cause with fellow Democrats. But of course, what we have now is a president making common cause with autocrats, who is disdainful of fellow democracies, who is giving talking points to despots around the world. Everyone from Bashar al-Assad to Duterte in the Philippines and Erdogan in Turkey are mimicking the president's attacks on our press. When they're criticized, they call it fake news. They describe their press as the enemy of the people. And where, of course, do they get this from? They get this from the President of the United States. The first hearing that we did in the Intelligence Committee when I became the chairman was on the rise of authoritarianism around the world. And I couldn't have had a more jarring demonstration of the importance of having that hearing and bringing it to the public's attention when the first thing that my ranking Republican said is, why are we even having this hearing? What we need to realize is that it's not just our own democracy at risk. The very idea of liberal democracy around the world is at risk. And I think for those of us that grew up in the post-World War II period, which is all of us in this room, we came to believe that somehow democracy and representative government was inevitable, inexorable, that it was a law of gravity, that the world was ever increasing in its freedoms with more people living in a free society, more people able to practice their faith, more people able to love whom they loved. Only to find there's nothing inexorable about this. And in fact, we've reached a very different inflection point than the one I hope we reach on guns. We've reached an inflection point where we cannot say with confidence that next year more people will live in a freer society than they do today. In fact, the opposite is likely to be true. And we certainly cannot say of the next generation that they will live in a freer world and have confidence that that is a self-effectuating truth. I like to believe, and the rabbi and I were talking about this earlier, I like to believe that the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends towards justice, but I'm convinced that it doesn't bend of its own accord. It bends only if we are all pulling in the direction of freedom. And so I think this is a critical time in the history of our democracy when we all have to be the champions of democracy. We all have to be the champions of human rights because it is not being demonstrated in the highest office in our land. And it's important for us to tell the rest of the world, it's important indeed for us to tell ourselves, this is what we stand for. Because the very idea of our country is now at risk. I was in Europe, I was in Munich with the speaker. She led a delegation of members for the Munich Security Conference. And you can imagine the consternation, the fear, the alarm of our allies about what they see.
You're getting ahead of me. You're getting ahead of me.
I forgot this was the lightning round.
Point B. Point B, the state of U.S. alliances. What do you consider the state of our alliances with our allies to be and America's status as a global leader? Are these alliances dependent on our president, or are they more resilient because of a bureaucratic infrastructure of support? And before you answer, this is a good time to request of the volunteers if you're able to pop up and maybe grab a few more of the note cards that have not yet been collected. So if you have one, maybe pass it to the aisle and hold it up. So, state of our alliances and how resilient they are.
Yes. Well, that is a perfect segue to Munich because one of the first meetings we had when our plane landed coincided with the landing of a presidential tweet. And we were meeting with the prime minister of one of our allied nations, and the tweet read something along the lines of, "Hey, Europe, you better take those 800 foreign fighters, because if you don't, I'm just going to release them and good luck with that." And so the prime minister says to us, is this how we're treated by our ally? There's no consultation between your ambassador and ours about how do we deal with this problem of the foreign fighters in Syria. There's no engagement between your president and ours. No, we have to get a threat on Twitter from your president. Now, when we're on foreign soil, we don't criticize our president. But how do you answer that? And no sooner did we return home than we were greeted on our landing back home by another presidential tweet. in which the president was responding to the request by a mother and child, an American mother and child who wanted to come home from Syria. And the president tweeted that he had instructed the Secretary of State, Pompeo, to make sure that she was not allowed back in the country, even for prosecution. So here's the message, Europe. You better take those 800 foreign fighters, but don't ask us to take a woman and child, because that's too much for us to take. So you can imagine how our allies feel about that.
Is there enough of a kernel of strength in that relationship that it's going to weather the storm?
Well, we were there in force, Democrats and Republicans, to do our best to reassure our allies that whatever Article 1 may think about, or Article 2 may think about this, Article 1 is solidly behind our alliances and NATO. But that only goes so far. The rest of the world isn't going to stand still while all this is happening. Other nations are deciding that maybe they need to hedge their bets. Maybe they need to cozy up to China. Maybe they need to cozy up to Russia, because maybe the United States can't be relied on anymore. Now, I firmly believe that when this president is out of office and we have a new president, that a lot of the damage can be...
I'm just going to remind everybody that we want to refrain from our applause until the end of the program. Thank you.
But I can't tell you who I'm supporting on that subject, which was aptly summarized by a protester's sign which read, "Any living adult 2020." That's as much of an endorsement as I feel comfortable making at this point. But I think when we do have a new president, that new president can very quickly begin to mitigate the damage, but the damage will not be undone overnight. I did a conference call a few weeks before the election with Democrats abroad in Tokyo. And you know, this is one of the marvels. Of course, the technological and information revolution isn't all bad. This was one of the marvels. I could sit at my desk early in the morning with my MacBook Air open, staring at the little webcam. And on the other side of the world was a reception of about 60 people in Tokyo having cocktails at night. And I was like on a big screen in their living room. And the very first question I got was, "Congressman, how do we assure our Japanese friends that when Donald Trump is gone, this nightmare won't recur?" And I said, you know, to be honest, you're not going to be able to persuade them. Around the world right now, people are wondering, is this an aberration? Is this, like Brexit, a bout of temporary insanity? Or is this who America is now? Is this a virus that even when it lays dormant can recur? And the only thing that will convince people, and it will take time, is the size of the repudiation and its durability. So people are hopeful because they have nowhere else to turn. They're not going to turn to China. They're not going to turn to Russia. They can't turn to Europe with all of its problems. You know, from their prison cells in Egypt or in Turkey, and Turkey is now the leading jailer of journalists in the world, the victims of mass extrajudicial killing in the Philippines, people who still celebrate democracy in Hungary or in Poland, you know, they look to us. There's nowhere else to turn. And they hope and they pray that this is an aberration. Because much as the idea of America as the indispensable nation has been given a bad name, we really are indispensable. There are things that we can do that no other nation can, for well or for ill. And it has been for well. And I have every confidence it will be for well in the future. I do want to say, because you know, talking about these things I know can be so discouraging, that I fully believe we're going to get through this. I fully believe we're going to get through this. We have been through far worse before in our history, with more violence during the civil rights movement in Vietnam, with more of a wrenching tragedy with our world wars and our Great Depression, and nothing can compare with the scope and scale of the Civil War. So we've been through far worse than this. At the end of the day, I always come back to something Bill Clinton once said: there's nothing wrong in America that can't be cured by what's right in America. And there's an awful lot right in America that will see us through this. So I don't want to leave you despondent about where we are. I do want to be candid about where we are. And at the same time, I think as long as we're going through this, we all have to ask ourselves in our civic capacity, in our corporate life, in our public life, in our private life, how can we make a difference right now while we are going through this terrible trial?
So in looking towards the future, with 2020 already on the horizon, we've been experiencing an increasingly tense partisan culture in the United States, and it's not just been under the last couple of years in this administration, it's been for the past few decades. So I want to know, what do you want to hear from the 2020 Democratic hopefuls in their rhetoric around hyperpartisanship that is both pragmatic, but also has the ability to draw us out of this spiral downward?
I would urge our candidates to focus on two things. One of which I think is propelling a lot of this rise in the vilification of the other. And it is that massive economic disruption that's going on. The tremendous economic anxiety that people here in the United States feel and people around the world feel. I had a meeting recently with community college trustees from my district, from Glendale and Pasadena and Los Angeles. And I was really struck by something I learned when I was talking with them, and that is that there are food banks on each one of their campuses. Food banks at the community colleges. And I asked them, was there a need for food banks on your campuses during the Great Recession? And the answer was no. The need is greater now. And to me, that was very telling of the circumstances we're in which, at a time of almost full employment, people are working, but they're not making enough to get by. That is, I think, among the gravest challenges that we face, is that the whole nature of work is changing with breathtaking speed. I gave a speech at Penn, and I left and I got into an Uber, and the Uber driver says to me, she says, "This is my lucky day." But before I could, get too big of a head, it had nothing to do with me. It had to do with the fact that she lived near the airport. And she said, "I just got off work and I can make some extra money taking you to the airport." And I said, "It's really interesting you should say that, because you didn't really just get off work, you just got off one work, and now you're starting another work." And when I got out of her Uber, I thought to myself, I don't know what her day job is, but I know her evening job doesn't provide health care and it provides no pension. And if her day job is like the night job, then eventually she's screwed. And that challenge, because we're going from a model where people work for the same firm for their whole life to now where people work for the same firm maybe 5 or 6 or 7 years, to a model where people might work for the same firm for the first 5 hours of their day and then move to the next firm. And we're going to need to think about how do people make a living, and how do people have retirement security, and how do people access health care in a world that is changing so quickly.
So an economic message has the ability to transcend the hyper-partisan bickering.
It does, and this is a challenge that not just Democrats need to face, but also Republicans. And I mention this because I think it's essential if we're going to honor the compact that our parents and grandparents had of passing on a world that was better than the one they inherited. But I also think, frankly, as a Democratic candidate, the biggest sector of Trump voters that we can win over were those who voted for him because they were at the end of their career, had nothing set aside for retirement, were going to have to work till they dropped. The future looked even less bright for their children, and they were ready to roll the dice on anything. And that is not a partisan message. That is a message that says, in fact, quite the opposite. I understand why you voted for this guy. But what he's doing isn't helping you at all. And it's not going to help you. But I have something that will. The other message that I think is a unifying message, and I think there is a deep wellspring within the country for anyone who can articulate this, is a simple return to decency.
All right. That's fine. You can applaud for that one. That's fine. So I'm going to start taking some of the audience questions right now. I have a number of questions on Israel from a lot of different political perspectives, some concerns about overemphasis on military aid, some concerns about the state of the regime currently in Israel. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to what your sense is of how the upcoming Israeli elections might impact our conversation in terms of our relationship with Israel. And if you have any thoughts about our current relationship with them and the financial support that we give to them.
Are we still in the lightning round?
Yes.
I wouldn't know where to begin to handicap what's going to happen in the elections in Israel and what will happen if the prime minister is successful but then indicted. I don't know how that shakes out, and of course he may lose the election, and so I have a difficult enough time prognosticating about our own elections. I'm haunted by something I kept saying in 2016 during the presidential primaries, when I would say there are two reasons why Donald Trump will never be the GOP nominee. The first is Republicans aren't that crazy, and the second is Democrats aren't that lucky. Turns out they were that crazy, and we're still not that lucky. But I will say this, and this is a deep concern of mine about the U.S.-Israel relationship, and this will be true no matter what happens in the election. And that is, like so many things in our political life right now, Israel is becoming a partisan issue, which is bad for us and bad for Israel. It used to be the case that U.S. support for Israel was bipartisan. It didn't matter who was in power in Israel. There was such an affinity of values and interests that it transcended whether it was Labor or Likud or Democrat or Republican. But for a variety of reasons, and I can certainly give you the Democratic perspective on this, there have been those who have wanted to make this a partisan issue. The decision to invite the Prime Minister to speak when Obama was president, that was not in the interest of the U.S.-Israel relationship. That was advantageous, though, to those who wanted to drive a wedge between the parties, and it may have been advantageous to the Prime Minister back home, but that was not in the interest of the relationship. And now we're in a situation where our president is so toxic among people in my party that anyone he wraps his arms around with is going to be covered in the taint. And there's already enough concern about the policies of the Netanyahu government among progressives without that embrace. And so I'm worried about the trajectory we're on, where there's a realignment between the GOP and Likud and the Democratic Party and anyone else. I don't know how to reverse that trend. Like so many things, it has a lot of contributors that have gotten us to where we are. but it is a worrying one. And I think that will not depend entirely on what happens in the election. Now, I do think that well, let me just leave it with that.
So you might not be able to, because I'm going to push you a little bit further on it and ask you to speak about the progressive critiques of Israel. And a lot of the questions frame it as anti-Semitism. Some of them frame it as legitimate. I am curious to hear from you how you're understanding the critiques from the left of Israel and whether it wades into those waters of anti-Semitism, and if so, what are the mechanisms within the progressive spaces to hold those voices accountable?
Well, there are certainly a great many progressives that have deep reservations about Israeli policy on the settlements and on a whole host of other issues. The inclusion of these right-wing hate groups as part of the governing coalition doesn't help matters, obviously. So I don't consider any of those concerns to be anti-Semitic in any way, shape, or form. You can love Israel, and millions of Americans love Israel and still disagree with the policies of any particular Israeli government. Just as we can love our own country and disagree with the policies of our own government. But there are undoubtedly times when the criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. And that occurs on the left as it occurs on the right. And I think when that happens, we need to call it out. Sometimes it happens out of ignorance, and sometimes it happens quite deliberately. And I certainly believe that there is a deep and abiding double standard when it comes to Israel that is at its core driven by an anti-Semitic view of the world, in which the Jewish state is held to a completely different standard than any of its neighbors. And so I think that there needs to be a space, and I think it is very important that it not be labeled as anti-Semitic for American Jews and American non-Jews to be able to criticize Israeli government policies. And to the degree that people attempt for whatever reason to label that as anti-Semitism, they do a disservice to the cause of fighting anti-Semitism.
I am going to remind everybody, I appreciate the applause and the enthusiasm, but please hold it to the end. I have a question here that acknowledges a gap in what I pose as national security issues. It's a question on climate change. And this attendee asks, as thanking you for your co-sponsoring of HR 763, the carbon fee and dividend bill. Are we going to see more people sign on to it soon? And just give us a little bit of a sense of your strategy on the climate change conversation in Congress in general.
I think we will see more people sign on to this particular legislation. And, you know, from my point of view, this is an issue of such surpassing importance that we need to be very aggressive about it. And I have no qualms, and I'm a supporter of the Green New Deal. I want to take an aggressive position and fight to move quickly because we don't know how much time we have before we reach that other cataclysmic tipping point.
We do. We've got 12 years.
Well, the estimate today is 12 years, but with each new estimate, it seems to be less than the one before.
Yeah.
And, you know, if I'm in a position of having to choose between being super aggressive in pursuit of an environmental policy and pick between a party that would have an oil and gas lobbyist as the Secretary of Interior and a coal mining lobbyist as the head of the EPA, and pulls out of the climate accord and appoints someone to head the energy department who wanted to abolish it but couldn't remember which one it was. then I'm all for a Green New Deal. I will pick that any day of the year. This is sadly for us and for the planet an area that should be completely nonpartisan. And I understand that the fossil fuel money is a driver of part of this, but this is such a no-brainer. Such a no-brainer. I remember 15 years ago going to a speech that the CEO of Google gave about the telecommunications revolution. And what he said really struck me, because this was 15 years ago. It's so much more true now. But he said the revolution in telecommunications will pale in comparison with the revolution in energy, which is a much bigger segment of our economy and the world economy. The United States derived enormous economic benefit by leading the telecommunications revolution. If we lead the energy revolution, it will create millions and millions of good, high-paying jobs. We will have innovation after innovation derived from those new technologies. It will be just an unmitigated winner. And we've ceded the ground to nations like China. And that's such a lost opportunity for us as a country. But it also means, of course, that we're losing precious time as a planet. Again, if we survive long enough, Democrats, but demographics are going to solve this problem, because the young people are not going to put up with this crap.
So I have a few questions about leading up to the 2020 election. So you should feel free to speak on anything from, do you think we should do away with the Electoral College, to you guys are very bad listeners with the clapping. Do you think we should do away with the Electoral College? Are we prepared for the hacking attempts by Russia in 2020? And are we confident about a peaceful transition of power?
Yes, no, yes. The Electoral College, you've probably seen that there's a multi-state effort to pass laws that would say that whoever wins the popular vote nationally will win all of the electoral votes from that state. That is probably the best path to doing away with the Electoral College. And we're going to have to turn a few more states blue before we get there, but we will get there, and I won't miss it. Let's see. I remember the last question, but the one in the middle was...
I don't know.
Which?
Somebody tell me what it is. Hacking. The hacking for 2020.
Are we ready? No. No, we're not ready. In a normal administration, I like to remember what that used to be. In a normal administration, the president would sit down with his or her cabinet and say, Director of the CIA, what are you hearing about Russian plans and intentions in 2020? Secretary of Defense, what kind of deterrent have we established? What is a proportionate response if we are forced to engage in one to the first cyber attack around our election? What are the rules of the road? What is a proportionate response to a social media campaign? Secretary of State, have you communicated to your counterpart that if they don't like the sanctions they have now, they've seen nothing compared to what we're going to slap on them if they do this again? Department of Homeland Security, what's happening in the states? What states are you having a problem with? You're having a problem with Alabama? Who has a relationship with the Secretary of State in Alabama? Who can get on the horn to the Secretary of State of Alabama? Who's taking advantage of the diagnostics we have that can help these states prepare and identify what their vulnerabilities are? He would be going around the room and asking them all what they're doing and making sure that they're talking with each other. None of that is happening because he's not going to do it, and for any of them to do it, he considers a threat to his legitimacy. It's an acknowledgement that the Russians interfered and might do so again. And the message, of course, the president delivered in Helsinki was, because this is the message that Vladimir Putin walked away from when the President of the United States said he believed Putin over his own intelligence agencies. The message was, this weak president will never challenge me as long as I intervene on his behalf. He may even be grateful. That was the message at Helsinki. So we are not as prepared, certainly, as we should be. But nonetheless, in the midst of all of that, there is work that the states are doing. There's work that the agencies, our agencies, are doing. It isn't as well coordinated. It isn't as high prioritized as it should be. But nonetheless, it has been going on. We are also forewarned and therefore somewhat prepared. And so there are new vulnerabilities with these new technologies that I mentioned earlier, but there have been precautions taken, notwithstanding the lack of leadership from the top. And finally, do I think there'll be a peaceful transition of power? The answer is yes. Not that the president, if he loses, will not complain that it was rigged. Of course he will. Of course he will. He complained it was rigged when he won. You can't make up any of this stuff. If millions of illegal immigrants voted in the election that he won, you can imagine how many more millions he will posit voted in the election that he lost. But I have faith in the American people not to respond to that. Now, there will be some of the people who have been effectively radicalized online. And so there's always the risk of some sporadic violence. We have that now. But I believe in the country, and I believe that we will accept the results of the election, whether Donald Trump likes them or not.
So I have a couple of procedural questions about the functioning of our House and our Senate. Do you support removing the legislative filibuster in the Senate to advance more sweeping legislation? It's a big one.
Well, I'm not often asked to opine on Senate procedure. We have our own challenges in the House. I think we have seen with the appointment of judges both the strengths and the weaknesses of doing away with the protections against the tyranny of the majority. And so it obviously cuts both ways. And I would think long and hard about the rules in the Senate before I changed it in a way that allowed the minority to be rendered even more moot than it is. The House is a very strongly majoritarian institution. If you have one more vote than the other side in the House, you control everything. And you can change the rules at any time. Historically, in the Senate, the minority had much greater influence than the minority in the House. And I don't know that I would advocate that the Senate should turn into the House. So I guess I would say I would think long and hard about changes along those lines. I will never forgive Mitch McConnell for holding up a Senate seat for an entire, Supreme Court seat for an entire year. I think that was among the most inexcusable betrayals of our constitutional system and attacks on a co-equal branch of government in my lifetime. But it has now set a precedent, of course. And it is a horrible precedent that we're going to have to live with.
Do you find that there are partners with whom you can truly work across the aisle and that you trust?
Yes, yes. And To give you one example, when I came to Congress, I formed a friendship with a number of my Republican colleagues in the same class, many of whom became my strongest allies on issues for decades. John Culberson lost his reelection this past cycle, but he was inseparably an ally of mine on all things NASA, and from my district point of view, JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. We both have an abiding love of space science and Earth science, but predominantly planetary exploration. And so for 18 years, we were inseparable on those issues, sometimes to the consternation of NASA, which was to pry us apart. Now, John and I did not discuss immigration or taxation or any number of other things that would divide us. We kept our focus on things that united us and had a fabulous partnership. One of the most moving phone calls I ever got was on the night we lost the House a decade ago, when Lamar Smith, a very conservative Texan, who was then, because of the loss of the House, going to be the new chairman of the Judiciary Committee, a committee on which I served, and a committee which is among the most partisan in the House because all of the issues that get people upset go through that committee. Whether it's guns or abortion or equality or you name it, it goes to that committee. And I was at my victory party in Pasadena, and it was obviously a very mixed affair because I had won my re-election, but we'd lost the House. And my phone, I had a BlackBerry then, it was that long ago, and my phone rings and I see it's Lamar Smith, from Texas. And it's already 11 o'clock at night in Pasadena. It's probably 1 in the morning in Texas. And I answer the phone, and Lamar says, "Good night for us, not so good for you." And I said, "That's true, Lamar, but you didn't have to call me to tell me that." And he said, "Well, that's not why I'm calling." I was on the Judiciary Committee and the Appropriations Committee. Now, that's not a common thing. You need a waiver to be on both the Appropriating Committee and the Authorizing Committee. And so Lamar said, "I know you're on the committee because you have this waiver, and now that you're in the minority, it's going to be more difficult to get that kind of a waiver, but I would love to have you stay on the committee. I enjoy working with you. If it's helpful, I'll call Nancy. If it's unhelpful, I won't call Nancy. You tell me what I can do." And, I was very touched by that. And there are relationships like that. And I do have Republicans tell me even now, in a hushed tone, because it's a heresy, keep doing what you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing. But I will say, of the great majority of my Republican colleagues in the House and Senate, I think that when this chapter of history is written, some of the most damning language will be reserved for the Republicans in Congress who did nothing when our democracy was under attack.
I'll save this one for last. I have one more question before our final question, which is not actually a question. I'm just going to say a word, because you're going to actually answer this however you want.
Is this a word association?
A little bit. About 80% of these had some relationship to the word Mueller.
Oh, gosh.
Frankly, I know it doesn't matter what question I ask you. You're going to answer in the way that you see fit and in a way that you are able to answer. So
it's Mueller time, that's what
so
you're
I'm
telling
just
me.
going to say, it's Mueller time. You got about 5 minutes.
I got about 5 minutes, okay. Well, then I'll try to use 5 minutes to tell you what I think is most important for people to know. And that is that this investigation began not as a criminal investigation, but as a counterintelligence investigation. And that's kind of a foreign concept to people. People intuitively understand what a criminal investigation is. It's an investigation into whether someone violated the law and should go to jail. So what is a counterintelligence investigation? What does that mean? Well, A counterintelligence investigation is initiated by the FBI and the intelligence community when there's reason to believe that, among other things, that an American may be acting as an agent of a foreign power, that there is a covert foreign influence operation going on in the United States. That was the origin of the investigation by the FBI, and it was also the origin of the investigation in my committee, in the Intelligence Committee. And that remains the focus of our investigation in the Intelligence Committee, even though there are many crimes that have been revealed as a result of the Mueller probe. The reason why the counterintelligence piece is so important is that there is certainly an interest of justice in having people who break the law go to jail. But there's a national imperative in knowing whether the president or people around him have been compromised by a foreign power in a way that leads him to adopt policies that are not in our interest, but in the interest of an adversary. And to give you the most graphic example, it seemed like the right punctuation at this point. To give you the most graphic example, I would give you Moscow Trump Tower. Moscow Trump Tower was a project, a real estate deal that Donald Trump was pursuing even as he was running for president. It was a deal he was pursuing even while denying he had any business with Russia. It was a deal he was pursuing which, if it were consummated, would have been the most lucrative deal of his life. Something the special counsel has estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Trump and his family. Now, he doesn't build things anymore, he licenses them. You don't make hundreds of millions of dollars licensing that name. But more significantly, and while this was concealed from the public and well into the presidential campaign, and while the president was calling for a different and more positive relationship with Russia and praising Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump was secretly seeking the help of the Kremlin to make it happen. That's staggering. That's staggering. Because it's so fundamentally compromising of this candidate who would become president. The fact that he knew that if he were to criticize Vladimir Putin, that deal was dead as a doorknob. That he certainly wanted and needed Kremlin approval. You're not going to build not only the tallest building in Russia, but what would have been the tallest building in all of Europe without the approval of the Kremlin, i.e. Vladimir Putin. So that certainly explains why he would have this bizarre departure from that part of Republican orthodoxy. Now, when this was discovered, when it was discovered that this attempt to make this deal happen didn't end, as they said, prior to the first caucuses, but went on until he became the presumptive nominee, when this was revealed publicly for the first time, the president said something very transparent. And this is, I think, quite remarkable because this is a man who is deceptive all the time. I mean, I don't know how many thousands of falsehoods we're up to now. I haven't seen the latest count. But he's deceptive all the time. But every now and then, he's remarkably transparent. I think most of the time because he doesn't realize how damning what he's about to say truly is. And in this instance, he was asked about this, and his answer was, hey, I might not have won the election. Why should I miss out on all those business opportunities? i.e., why should I miss out on all that money? Well, that may very well be his view to this day. I might not get reelected. Why should I miss out on all that money? And if that's what's guiding U.S. policy, that's a problem. Whether it's a crime or not, that's a problem. And if there is more where that came from, that's an even bigger problem. We do know this, that when it was revealed that they made inquiries to the Kremlin for the Kremlin's help, and sought Dmitry Peskov's help, this spokesperson for the Kremlin, someone close to Putin. When that became public, Dmitry Peskov issued a public statement saying, "We never responded to that outreach." That was a lie. And so you have the Kremlin helping the president cover up this compromise, which is even more compromising. And so when the report is issued and goes to Bill Barr, we will get some report from Bill Barr, but it will be the Barr report, not the Mueller report. And it will be important to insist that the Mueller report is public. But what will be probably more important is that the evidence that Mueller has found, particularly on the issue of compromise, be disclosed to Congress, whether it resulted in indictment or it didn't. Both because if it's the department's position that you cannot indict a sitting president, which I think is a flawed and erroneous interpretation, but if it's their policy that you cannot indict a sitting president, and it is also their policy that you cannot share information about someone not indicted, that amounts to immunity. It's also just plain not true, because for the last 2 years, the Department of Justice gave voluminous discovery to the Congress about the Clinton email investigation. As of June of 2018, the department informed me by letter they had given the Republican Congress 880,000 pages of discovery in an investigation in which, the last time I checked, as it pertained to the Clinton email investigation, no one was indicted. So it is not at all their policy not to provide discovery, even when someone is not indicted, when there is a compelling public interest. And the interest here is even more compelling. Because in the case of Hillary Clinton, who did not become president and did not run the Justice Department, she was not in a position to cover up any crime. Donald Trump is. And we have seen time and time again his efforts to interfere with the independence of the Justice Department and the investigation. And so the most important struggle may be over making sure that that evidence, those facts, any potential compromise is not concealed, that it is shared with Congress and it is ultimately shared with the public, so that we can know whether the president or anyone around him is acting out of some financial interest or acting out of some fear of compromise rather than in the best interest of the country.
So the final question of the evening is our most speculative question of the evening, which is, what do you see in the future for yourself?
Oh. I wasn't expecting that question. To be honest, I have no idea. I have no idea. Aren't there enough people running? I would run, except like AOC, I'm simply not old enough to run. I don't know. I do know that I feel I have a very important responsibility at the moment that I need to see through to its conclusion. And I'll let the future take care of itself. People thank me for what I'm doing, and I appreciate it. I always, when somebody says thank you for what you're doing, your temptation to say it's my pleasure. It's not a pleasure. But I do think it's necessary. And, you know, my goal right now is to get up in the morning, do the very best job I can do to protect this beautiful democracy we've built until it's time to go to bed. And wake up and repeat until the nightmare is over. So that's, I will, I will tell you this, one of the things that keeps me going is to imagine the one hell of a party we're going to have when this guy is voted out of office.
Congressman, we want to thank you. We want to thank you for your service and for your integrity and for everything that you do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before you all go, I have a brief message from Sue Brucker, who heads our gun violence prevention group here at Temple Emmanuel, on a very simple action that you can help take. So Sue, I'm going to turn it over to you, another 2 minutes, and then you are welcome to leave.
Actually, it's only going to be like 1 minute, but quite a few people asked, what can we do? First of all, thank you so much, Congressman Schiff, for what you do. What we can do to help our congressmen help pass very important legislation regarding gun violence prevention is to write letters and to make phone calls. And actually, every letter written does count, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, and phone calls as well. You can call the Senate's switchboard, which is the next step helping with the H.R. 8 that we just passed with Congress. But the Senate bill is S-42, and that's a similar bill. And if you can write letters, outside there's a table with, and actually you all received this. Please call the Senate switchboard 202-224-3121 or write the letters to our representatives. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Run away. Oh, let's take your...
To that little voice inside telling me